the power of delusion. Respect it, even fear it. For we are not safe until we reach final union with God. Very ponderous and scary words for a devotee. Because, of course, our goal is to try to overcome whatever delusion that we might have. And we're not safe until we have union with God. And so this story of the fall of Judas is very instructive for us as devotees. And it's a sad thing for Judas, of course, to have betrayed his master. And yet one of the things that Christ did was that he chose his disciples. So all of the apostles, he chose. And he chose them because in previous lives they had attained high spiritual attainments. They were high souls, including Judas. And yet, of course, like all of us who have not yet attained God realization, they had within them other qualities, other traits that were not perhaps so purified and so high. And so in Judas, he had this karmic bomb. And Jesus knew both his spiritual aspirations and attainments, as well as the karma that was in him, the karma that might have led and could have led and did lead, ultimately, to the betrayal of Jesus. And yet Jesus, through his love for Judas, he considered him the prodigal son, because in a previous lifetime, Judas had been a spiritual aspirant. And then at the very end of that life, he had turned away from God and re-embraced greed and worldliness. And so he was a prodigal son in this life, and Jesus was aware of that. And he loved Judas, and he wanted to give him the opportunity to grow spiritually. He wanted to give him the satsang of the other disciples, the other Christ-like disciples, and of course of Christ himself. He wanted to offer the opportunity for Judas to overcome the karmic bomb. Unfortunately for Judas, that did not happen. And of course, we know the rest of the story. He became indignant. And in part, this idea of delusion is very, very tricky, because Judas sincerely wanted Jesus' mission to succeed. He wanted people to be inspired and uplifted and find the peace of God that he knew was possible. He believed deeply in Christ and the mission that Christ offered. But he was slightly off in the sense that he thought that perhaps the mission would be better served by trying to become more mainstream, trying to incorporate behaviors and attitudes that would make it easier for the religious hierarchy of the day, the Pharisees, to be able to embrace Jesus. And of course, that really wasn't specifically Jesus' message to the world. Whenever he did something that outraged the Pharisees, he did so for a very specific reason, trying to nudge them away from the letter of the law, the intellectual aspect of trying to interpret the scriptures, and to nudge them into the concept of inner communion with God, the deeper truths, the deeper realities. And so part was inevitable, that there would be disagreements between Jesus and the Pharisees. And this was uncomfortable for Judas because he wanted the idea of acceptance. And he also wanted the message to be sent to as many as possible. It's interesting that by his fall, by his betrayal, he of course helped Jesus spread the message, because it moved beyond just that lifetime with those 12 disciples and whoever might have heard Jesus speak into a movement that's lasted for thousands of years. And so when Jesus was crucified, and died on the cross and was resurrected. That mission of overcoming the fear of death and pain and offering to those that could see and hear the promise of spiritual resurrection. That's what was offered. And so with Judas's fall, of course he was devastated. And yet we have to keep in mind that many years later, such was Jesus' love for all of his disciples, including Judas. And Yogananda tells the story that he met the reincarnated Judas in his lifetime, and that Judas had lived in an ashram in India. And Jesus came to the master of that ashram and interceded on Judas's behalf and asked that Judas be liberated in that lifetime. And so such is the love of God for all of us. Because even though 2,000 years seems like an awfully long time to wait for liberation, nonetheless, that love was offered. It was offered originally while he was an apostle of Jesus's, and it never wavered through all those lifetimes. Now, we fail occasionally in our spiritual pursuits, maybe not as dramatically as Judas did, but nonetheless, we have times where we struggle to meet our spiritual aspirations, to live in divine truth, and to always choose the higher path. Delusion is powerful, and it's tricky, because how do we even know what delusion is? Our mind, we try very hard to understand divine truths. We try very hard to live to those ideals, but we don't fully understand them until we continue to grow ever deeper in understanding of God's light and live in that light and truth. And so we struggle to understand what really is victory, what is delusion, how do we know? And of course, we get hints, because as we grow, that we learn and we fail and we get back up. We try again and we start to discern. See, this is why discernment is an important part, and why Krishna says that, if you focus too much on the senses, desire appears, and then from desire you get infatuation and annihilation of discernment, and then annihilation of the spiritual search. You stop wanting to know God. The only way we can truly fail is if we stop trying. If we stop trying to find God, if we actively turn away, then we fail. But if we strive with whatever effort we can muster, regardless of the trials that we're facing, ultimately we will succeed. Ultimately so. And we need to keep that in mind, because oftentimes confusion reigns, and we think we're doing the right thing. We think we're acting in a way that reflects the divine within us. And then, lo and behold, somehow or another, disharmony occurs in our world, either directly through interactions with people we know, or through the world in a larger sense. And we wonder, are we really reflecting the highest that is within us? I remember a story of a friend of mine, and he's a wonderful devotee. He uses introspection a great deal. In other words, self-study, observing his behaviors, observing his thoughts, holding them up to the light of the wisdom at the point between the eyebrows and asking, how did I do? This is good practice to be every day. How did I do? What was the battle like today? Did the higher qualities win out? Or were we inundated by all the different things that get in the way of expressing divine love and joy? And of course, for most of us, again, a mixed bag. Some places we might succeed on a given day, and others we will fail horribly. though perhaps not as publicly and for the same length of time. I mean, poor Judas, can you imagine being the soul that over eons is remembered as betraying Jesus? I mean, most of us when we fail, it's not quite that spectacularly. We fail and maybe a few people know about it, but it's not written in the Bible and it's not talked about in scriptures throughout the world. But nonetheless, you laugh, but can you imagine how uncomfortable that would be? And Lord knows we have enough spotlights on us and, it's awkward enough. But the fact is, all we can do when we fail is but get up and try again. And so this devotee, he had an altercation with a fellow devotee. And it made him angry. And I don't mean angry for a short period of time and then it blew over. I mean angry for weeks at a time. I mean, he was just raging internally at whatever had happened or this person had done. I don't know the circumstances, it's not really important. But what was important was this anger was lasting a long period of time, and this devotee was devastated by it. Because he understood that he needed to move beyond that. And that this anger was creating misery for him. So even if he did nothing to further escalate the problem with his fellow devotee, he was suffering tremendously as a result of the reaction of anger. And so he went and he did his different spiritual practices. And he meditated deeply and he prayed for this soul. Peace and harmony, peace and harmony. Weeks he did this, weeks. And finally in his heart, he found peace again in that circumstance. Peace towards that fellow devotee. And forgiveness for whatever wrong he had perceived had happened. Now you'd think the story would end there, but this is where it gets very instructive. Because he'd spent that effort to rise above it. And then one day he saw that devotee across, a field or something. And he saw the devotee and he had his thought. Why was I so angry at him? You guys recognize that thought? That one little spot where delusion first comes in? Yogananda tells us that when delusion first appears, that is the time to stop it. But would you assume that just having the thought of, why was I so angry at him, be a severe delusion? But what happened was at that thought, the rage and the anger and the circumstances came flooding back into his being, as if it had never gone away. There he was again in the midst of that misery. And all because he had a seemingly innocent thought of why was I angry at him. That's how tricky delusion can be. And of course the samskars within us resonate with different kinds of vibration and energy. And so we never know what karmic bombs are waiting for us. Jesus knows. He saw what was happening with Judas, but he wanted him to have the opportunity because he loved him so much. And he knew there was a chance that if he had chosen, he being Judas, had chosen wisely with discernment, set aside his judgment, set aside his sense of I know better, set aside his wish for mainstream acceptance, for worldly power, because essentially he wanted the worldly power to help spread the spiritual power. And of course he had that backwards. And so Judas failed. But one thing that's very interesting in this process, because through introspection, we try to open ourselves up to the wisdom of intuition, the whisper of the divine wisdom flowing within our own selves. No matter how badly we do, or others think that we do, we are a soul united with God. We simply have to increase our knowing of that capacity. And so in this story, Krishna gives us this dire warning. And yet in his conversations with Arjuna, he also consoles Arjuna and encourages him. And he tells us that no spiritual effort is ever lost. We just need to continue striving. And he also promises that even a little practice of this inward communion will free us from dire fears and colossal sufferings. What a beautiful promise. Even a little practice. Now most of us can muster up a little practice. Maybe if we're not doing our meditation practices very well, or we're not being very serviceful, or we know our attitudes are slightly off kilter, sometimes it's literally just by the skin of our teeth we're holding on to God and Guru. Holding on as hard as we can with every bit of strength we've got left. And we may be hanging there off the cliff, just our little fingernails holding on to the cliff's edge, but we're still holding on. And that makes all the difference. That makes all the difference. And so we offer ourselves through our spiritual practices, and we continue on striving. There's the parable of the wheat and the tares. And of course, the tares can translate into weeds. And the story that Jesus tells is of a landowner, and he and his servants plow a field and plant wheat. And in the night comes the man's enemies. And in that field they had just planted with the seeds of wheat, they plant the seeds of tares or weeds. And of course they irrigate the field, unknowing that the seeds of tares were in there with the wheat. And when the plants start to sprout, the servants notice that not everything in the field is wheat. Some of them are tares, some of them are weeds, obnoxious weeds. And what do? And their inclination was to go into the field and root out individually each and every weed, pull them all out. And of course, sometimes we're not able to discern which little sprout. If you've ever gardened and you planted with seeds and you've mixed some things next to each other, sometimes you can't tell the beginning plant of one type of plant from the other. They look pretty similar in the early stages. And so the landlord, the man who owned the land, told his servants not to pull the weeds at this point, lest you also remove the wheat unconsciously, in other words, unintentionally. And part of what this represents is the wheat, of course, is spiritual aspirations and spiritual power and understanding and wisdom. And the weeds represent those qualities that are not quite so divine, the obnoxious weeds of our behaviors, our personalities, our likes, our dislikes, our bad habits. And yet if you focus on the spiritual practices and you empower those, then the weeds have less power. And so he said, let the field ripen. And when it comes time for the harvest, at that point, it will be easier to discern the difference between the weeds and the wheat. And you can take those weeds and you can burn them in the wisdom that you've gained in your spiritual progress. In other words, regardless of when you put the searchlight of the vine into your being and you see what lives and what creatures lurk in the darkness of your soul, you see those things arranged against you. It's easy to cower. It's easy to say, what the heck, why should I even try? And yet, if you give your spiritual practices the effort, all of that will be wiped away. The magnetism of divine love, the magnetism that Jesus offered, the fact that the Guru will come eons later, thousands of years later, to intercede on our behalf if we fall horribly. Well, what does the Guru do in the times where we fall? Not so horribly. Same thing. There for us always, to inspire, uplift, guide, protect, if we but make the effort. And that's the key. We simply need to make the best effort that we can. And know that in that promise that Krishna gave to Arjuna, even a little of this spiritual practice of inner communion will free us from dire fears and colossal suffering.